Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast delving into one issue facing Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Rabbi Noa Sattath. Noa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It is such a pleasure, and we are going to delve into so many different roles that you've played in the past, several decades. Of course, you are an ordained Reform rabbi, and currently you are the head of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. But in the past, you were, of course, also the executive director of Israel Religious Action Center, IRAC, as it's more commonly known. And before that, you were also the executive director of the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance. This month is June, and we're marking Gay Pride Month. So we're going to start by discussing a little bit of Israel's backstory with the gay community, and then we're going to move into democracy and human rights. All of this when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation to humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu Amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Rabbi Noa Sattath. Now, we are going to discuss the connection between the gay community here in Israel, the struggle for equal rights, and the broader struggle for democracy and for Israel. This is Gay Pride Month. And so, Noa, can you just begin by giving us a bit of an overview of the community's fight for equal rights and acknowledgement? Can you tell me, first of all, obviously Israel doesn't have a constitution, but when it was founded in 1948, was there anything on the books that discriminated against the gay community at that time?
Israel inherited from the British Mandate any laws that were not changed by the Knesset. So basically, we inherited the sodomy laws, the British sodomy laws that were only changed in the 80s. So that was the biggest kind of discriminating factor, is that same-sex intercourse was criminalized. It was only once enacted. The Attorney General said, we're not interested in enforcing this offense, but it was criminalized in the law books until the 80s.
And what would have been the enforcement of this law?
No, it was, I don't really remember, but it was years of arrest for same-sex, and that's not uncommon. That was the situation around the world where same-sex sex was criminalized.
Okay, so only in the 1980s was that actually formally repealed. But in the meantime, of course, I have a gay son, and he fills me in with some of the history here and there. But tell us about the rollout of the community in terms of its visibility in Israel.
So it's interesting because your son's probably 30 years younger than me, but it feels like we're, centuries apart in terms of visibility. I remember that when we first put up the Pride flag in the Jerusalem Open House, which was, I think, in 2002, maybe 2003. And the open house then was above the Ben Yehuda pedestrian mall in central Jerusalem. And we put this big rainbow flag. And it was a very, very tense time security-wise. So we put up the flag, and then 10 minutes later, the police comes in and says, "What is this flag?" I mean, they weren't homophobic. They just did not know what we were talking about. And that was our experience with visibility over and over again in the early 2000s, which was it's just not so long ago.
Right. What you're
But
saying is completely shocking to me. Of course, we need to remind our listeners that that was during the second Intifada. So I assume that was the police concern.
yeah, no, and once they understood that it was an LGBT flag, they left. They just didn't know what that was. Um, when the open house opened in 2001, we opened an office. And so it was big news for Jerusalem to have an LGBT center for the first time. And there was then a local TV news station. So they were covering the event and they showed the images, and then and it was a very progressive station. And then the anchor, showing these images, and they're being very supportive in their coverage. And the progressive anchor kind of sits up and says, "We believe there may be as many as 400 gays and lesbians in Jerusalem." In 2001, the progressive station was saying that. I mean, we were so invisible that it was hard for people to imagine that we were actually here. So the sea change we're seeing in terms of visibility is just yeah, it's hard to quantify. And these were the years. I mean, I think that Dana International made a big difference when she won the Eurovision Song Contest. That was in '97. There were other major figures that came out in those years, and that was kind of the beginning of the change in visibility for the LGBT community.
But what you're saying essentially is in Jerusalem, it was still considered completely not on the map. Whereas obviously in Tel Aviv, where there's a much more out and loud community, it was probably much more accepted during this time period. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the gay pride marches were already big in the beginning of the early 200s in Tel Aviv, when they were completely non-existent in Jerusalem at that point. And I think that that's something that happens in all struggles of the community. I mean, every country has a San Francisco where the cutting edge, or in New York where the cutting edge of the LGBT struggle happens both culturally and legally. And then there's what is called the frontier, the more conservative areas of the country, where the LGBT community struggles to exist, to be visible. And those are two complementing parts of the struggle, because if you only struggle in the cultural capitals, then it's a bubble that cannot exist long term. So both struggles need to support each other.
Right. But even within Jerusalem, arguably, there still is a bit of a bubble because it is a real community, or at least it has been traditionally. Wouldn't you say, in that there is something that binds people together? And part of that is, of course, the open house that you directed for many years.
Yeah. So the Jerusalem Open House, back then when I directed it, was the only LGBT organization in town. So I got to work with all sectors of, Palestinians, ultra-Orthodox. Right now, there are multiple organizations catering to different communities. But yeah, there is a common thread that that unites many of us in some of our experiences. I think that the internal divides that are happening in society, in the general society, are obviously having a huge impact also inside the LGBT community.
Right, because obviously being gay doesn't mean that you wear feathers and that you vote Meretz. Meretz that was, right? These are stereotypes. And of course, the gay community is filled with as many varied voices as there are in the non-gay community. So obviously that needs to be made clear. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how the army has influenced the gay community. And there's at least some kind of urban legends or a living mythology that the army, in spite of its very macho profile, has actually been a bit of an oasis for the gay community after it was legislated to be such. Am I understanding things properly?
I think that the answer is probably more complex. I mean, Israel's now probably 40 years into the inclusion of LGBT people in the military began in '92, I think. So many years ago, and that's a mixed bag. I mean, in some senses, there are many units where LGBT people serve. It's an essential part of being an Israeli Jew to serve. So having access to that, there are many units that do not discriminate. And there are other stories in different units that the culture has, at least has been difficult and homophobic. It's a very varied experience. I do think that the military is spending resources and trying to make sure that all soldiers are safe and accepted.
Right. And in fact, I have three children who are serving in combat roles right now. And one of my children talks about a trans soldier that serves with her in a combat unit, and that this person was given a lot of space and their own time in the bathrooms and things of that nature. So it is a bit
the military has
contradictory.
also gone through a big change, probably in the last decade in terms of trans soldiers, and that is also kind of in contradiction to what is happening in the U.S. when the attempts to ban trans soldiers. Yes, absolutely.
Right. But a lot of this change has happened through the Supreme Court. When you say much of this had to be pushed through legal channels in order for it to happen on the ground. So talk to me a little bit about this.
Yeah, so the system of change in Israel has been mostly, I think, through cultural change, through community organizations, and through the Supreme Court. There have been many precedent-setting cases in the Supreme Court in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of recognition of in-family adoption, adoption from outside the family, recognition of same-sex marriage from abroad, all sorts of processes in terms of recognizing trans identity. All of that has happened in the Supreme Court through the push of the organizations. I can think of, there's been one dramatic piece of legislation in the early 90s that included sexual orientation in the non-discrimination clauses, which is really significant and is being used until now. And there's been another piece of legislation around students' rights. But all of the progress is happening outside of the Knesset. The Knesset, for many, many years, has been a very homophobic arena. And right now, it's hard to tell whether laws would pass, but I think the government would. I mean, it's hard to tell whether there are 61 fingers to promote LGBT-friendly legislation, but the government is against them because of the partnership with the Haredi parties. So even if there is a majority, it's not going to be passed through.
Meaning, even if the individual lawmakers would be for such legislation, it's unlikely because of the makeup of the coalition that anything would be passed through the Knesset. But at the same time, organizations such as yours and the other ones you've led throughout your years are still pushing through different bills, or not bills, but different petitions in order to make sure that equal rights are maintained or at least given.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think that LGBT progress is often, a collaboration of many different forces. So the organizations are doing amazing work in pushing legal cases. Cultural figures are normalizing it so that the judges are much more likely to support these kinds of petitions, and the community is in many places, very visible. But as you know, as your audience already know, because they follow you, everything in Israel is complicated, right? So on the one hand, many LGBT people in Israel live lives openly, have families, are not suffering discrimination. But we need to bear in mind that Israel is a very mixed society. So the 21% of the society, which is Palestinian, it's not like they don't have access to rights, but because the society is much more traditional, then there are, less or almost no same-sex families, no same-sex marriages, etc. Same is true for the 12% of Israel that are ultra-Orthodox, and many other different more traditional communities that are facing real challenges. And these are not legal barriers. These are societal norms and cultures that are very homophobic and oppressive. And so the community is incredibly diverse in terms of what people experience and what they could achieve in their lives openly, which is one of the reasons we still have to be very aware of the privilege that we as Jewish LGBT people from the center of Israel have, and try to expand that so that other LGBT people, or even the majority of LGBT people in Israel, can have access to that.
Right. You mentioned, of course, the 12% of Israeli citizens who are ultra-Orthodox. They, of course, have the option of leaving their communities, remaining Israeli citizens and Jews, and adapting to a slightly less stringently observant lifestyle and living within Jewish communities. But the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Arab, feel themselves Palestinian, don't necessarily have these options. Obviously, people can live in different parts of the country, meaning in Haifa, for example.
Haifa is a very LGBT queer Arab haven, but I think that full equality for LGBT people is when we don't have to choose, when we don't have to move to Tel Aviv or to Haifa if we're Palestinians in order to live our lives, because an LGBT person is LGBT, but they may also be very connected to their community where they're living. And leaving the ultra-Orthodox community when you don't have core curriculum, when all of your life you've lived in this closed community, it's incredibly hard. It's a huge rupture, which many people choose to do because that's the only way, but it's not a good way. The better way, which hopefully we will work towards and achieve in the future, is that people can be LGBT wherever they are in their own communities.
For sure. And I was just this weekend speaking with a friend whose child is trans, and she's part of a trans parent group. And she was talking about a situation in which one of the mothers had to leave Bnei Brak because her child is trans and another child is gay, and a third child is also gay, but still within the community in the closet. And so she's walking this tightrope of secrecy and openness and close. And it's just extremely complicated for a lot of people in Israel. So not everything is through these rose-colored glasses that the Supreme Court is the champion and has achieved equality for everyone.
The Supreme Court is playing a pivotal role, but again, we have to, for a community to be successful, it needs to have the avant-garde that is working in the courts, and it needs to be in society in the more conservative places as well.
Okay, let's go to a short break, and then we're going to discuss the fight for democracy and the blowback from international gay communities to this war.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Rabbi Noa Sattath. Now, Noah, we were discussing the history in Israel of the gay community. And of course, one of the headlines that has made racket all throughout the world, and especially in Jewish communities, is what many pro-Israel Jews perceive as the hypocrisy of the gay community throughout the world in its condemnation of Israel for this war and its alignment with Hamas or with Gaza. You are in a completely different headspace than I am. So I want, if you could, to try and explain to me how this cross-section happened. How did this connection happen among the international gay community?
So I think the LGBT community, the Palestinian LGBT community, has been working in progressive circles around the West in order to raise awareness to the Palestinian question, and has been very successful in many of the progressive places, and maybe most of all with the LGBT community, where there's a sense of kinship, also maybe with communities of color. And I think that most of the people the LGBT people from around the world who are supportive of the Palestinian cause are aware that that there are no or very few LGBT rights for Palestinians in the areas that are governed by the Palestinian Authority or by Hamas. And I think that they're able to say, we're critical of that, but we still feel that Palestinians deserve freedom, and maybe they also feel that once the occupation question is resolved, then the LGBT question will either be resolved on its own or be able to get more attention and be resolved like that. I think that any progressive person who supports Hamas is, maybe not really understanding maybe conflating between Palestinians and Hamas, or not really understanding the situation.
Right. And of course, I mean, we're both parents, and we know that young people can be a little headstrong and perhaps slightly less informed than they would be as they get older. But the stereotypical, pink-haired, non-binary Columbia University protester who is not making this differentiation is, in my mind at least, doing a real disservice to the LGBT community itself. And have you had these uneasy, cringy thoughts as you've seen this playing out before your own eyes?
I mean, I think that, when I see like queer and trans for Hamas signs, that weirds me out a little bit. I have to say that I feel like that is not a good alignment. But I think that it's interesting, the focus on this question in progressive circles, maybe even more interesting in progressive circles outside the U.S., because the U.S. is so heavily invested in the war. But I'm very curious to see what this support translates to as people get older, and maybe I'm worried that this would be this is a trend that's not really in support of Palestinian rights, and that it lacks the depth. But also, it's been a movement for a long time, and we'll have to see how it works and what it does in the world. It's a really interesting phenomena to watch, and I've seen kind of surveys of university students in terms of support for being pro-Palestinian, or I don't remember what the question was in the survey, but maybe like across university students it was 20% of support for the Palestinian side in the war. For LGBT students, it was over 50. Like LGBT students were much more involved, and for trans and non-binary people, it was even more. So obviously, this is a struggle that speaks to the LGBT community more than to the straight community.
Right. And you yourself said that when you were the executive director of the open house was open to everyone. And I think it was probably extremely rare, especially in 2002, I believe you said it was open, which again was during the Second Intifada, extremely rare that Jews and Muslims would be getting together in any kind of forum during this era. And I assume as your roles have progressed and you've become the head of many different other organizations, and especially right now, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, you have much more access to the Palestinian community than most other Israeli Jews do. And so this probably also plays a bit of into your ability to fight for the civil rights for all versus just the Jews, as so many, I don't want to stereotype, but so many Israeli Jews are prone to do. So tell us a little bit about your psyche, shall we say, Noah?
Oh, right now? Well, I think that we're in many ways living through what I hope, that these are the final days of the tragedy of a generation. I mean, just the depth of the sorrow and the pain on both sides, but right now, specifically on the Gaza side, are unimaginable. I'm a history buff, so I like to look for examples in history. And so, obviously, as Jews, we know the disasters of our history, but I've been looking for, when on this land, when was the last time there was such a big tragedy? And I think that the closest equivalent that I have found is the Crusader War in the 12th century, where there were 16,000 casualties in a Crusader War, and the entire population of the entire country was 250,000. So it was a huge tragedy, but it's such an enormous magnitude of pain. And we at ACRI are obviously trying to do whatever we can to protect human and civil rights of everybody. From evacuees to people in poverty to Arab society inside Israel to the West Bank with the escalating violence there and the issues inside Gaza. And on all of those issues, there's very distinct deterioration. And on all of these issues, we're doing everything we can and we're making progress very, very slowly. So I'm very engrossed in trying to understand what our role is in these times.
But how did you yourself get involved in what one could call coexistence organizations? You also were the head of MEET, which is an organization that uses technology to bridge between Palestinians and Israelis. It was active in several of my kids' schools, actually, and several of their friends were extremely active in it. And it really created these spaces that perhaps right now are not currently available during the war, but at least before the war, spaces in which there was people-to-people communication. So how did you yourself get involved in that?
So, I grew up in a very sheltered life, even though I was in Jerusalem, and my involvement with different communities really began at the Jerusalem Open House, and that's when I got to learn a lot, only from the Jerusalem perspective, but it was major. I mean, when I began at the Jerusalem Open House, there was no barrier between Jerusalem and Ramallah. So people would come from Ramallah, and as I was there, the wall was being built, and some of our community was shut off from us. So that was a really big learning opportunity for me then.
Just for our listeners, I'll add that this is the separation barrier that Noah is referring to that was built in order to stop the wave of suicide bombing and terrorism from the West Bank. Arguably, it actually succeeded. But of course, there was casualties in this or collateral damage. And one of these, Noah is mentioning the separation of the gay community. Please continue.
Well, I mean, yeah, there are many, many issues on the separation, but yeah, that was the one I experienced very, very acutely. And really, when I was at the Jerusalem Open House, I got to witness kind of the big role of religion and identity that it played, as it played in people's lives, both in terms of really oppressive forces and also really progressive forces. And when I left the Jerusalem Open House, I wanted to look at social justice issues from a broader perspective than the LGBT perspective. And I got to work with many different organizations trying to look at these core issues of equality and access and and shared society in many different from many different points of view. And ACRI, being the largest organization with the largest mandate, is really a great opportunity to be looking at all these issues. I think that it really is hard to convey how crazy and impossible and unfathomable the idea of having an LGBT center in Jerusalem or having LGBT pride in Jerusalem was when we started thinking about it. And as I saw these things materialize through, very, very painful struggles, I think that's when I kind of developed a faith that this is both important work and also work that could be very painstaking, but also ultimately successful. So that's what brought me to, when I started there, I was involved in software and did a, very comfortable and cushy job. And I left in order to do this kind of work because I find it really inspiring to be able to create change in society.
Right. After seeing the tidal shift that has occurred in terms of gay pride in Jerusalem, you see that there is possibility elsewhere. And this work that you're doing right now is arguably a lot more difficult, and it goes against a lot more cultural stigmatism than you had even potentially with the gay rights movement. So tell us what you're doing right now in terms of specifically the war, shall we say?
Well, the war has had massive implications on all civil and human rights, both in terms of the oppression of free speech and the freedom to demonstrate. So we're doing all sorts of cases around anti-war demonstrations, around policemen grabbing signs from protesters. One of my favorite cases is that somebody was holding a sign that looks like, wow, I forgot the word. How do you say Luchot HaBrit?
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, and it said Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not murder, and the police took that as an illegal sign. So we're seeing all sorts of those types of expressions, and we're trying to fight back to restore freedom of expression and freedom of protest. We're seeing a lot of added violence against the Palestinian communities in the West Bank, which we're constantly responding to in many different ways. We're seeing the evacuees from the north and from the south that are not getting the right treatment from the government. We're representing them. We're seeing mistreatment of prisoners, specifically Palestinian prisoners, both in terms of conditions, food, and access to transparency and Red Cross. We're representing them on that, and when we're trying to have an impact on the issue of humanitarian aid to Gaza that is now trickling in, but it does not currently meet the needs of the population. There much more work to be done in that area.
So have you been accused of being a traitor at all during this period of war in terms of your aid and push for civil rights and humanitarian rights for these Palestinian prisoners, for example, or for the Gazans?
It's been really interesting because one of the most unpopular cases that we've had is the case of the Palestinian prisoners. And of course, there are just, for the data, there are 10,000 Palestinian security prisoners held in Israeli prisons. Many of them were held on October 7th, so they're not connected to the war. Most of them are from the West Bank, and the number of people who were arrested in Gaza or on October 7th is minimal in terms of that group. But of course, we believe all of them have deserve equal civil rights. And when we started the cases about the treatment of prisoners, and there was a time when they were not getting enough food, so we petitioned against that in court, and there were right-wing protesters who came and said, you care about the prisoners and you don't care about the hostages, which, of course, if there was anything that we could do to make sure that the hostages would get more food or get freed, we would do everything. We don't have the ability to petition against Hamas. And they were, accusing us and doxing us online. And then when the hostages returned, they said we were being starved because Palestinian prisoners were being starved. So not only is it morally wrong and illegal to starve prisoners, it's also not helping our hostages at all when Israel is mistreating prisoners. So we've been the climate for human rights work always gets worse during wars. Usually wars don't last this long. So this has been a time where when our lawyers go to court, we go with protective presence because extreme right-wing people are, doxing and harassing our lawyers going in and going out. There have been several hate campaigns against us, and it's been a very challenging time to be doing this work. As we're part of Israeli society, we're experiencing the pain and the grief and the worry that everybody else is experiencing. So it's been very, very challenging. I'll just share one story about kind of what it was like. In the beginning of the war, there were many blockades in the West Bank around different cities and towns. And that's a huge human right infringement. If you can't get to your work and to your school and to your to hospitals. So we had multiple petitions, even in October, around these issues. And I was giving an interview to a foreign news service about these blockades, but it was a lot of information. So the interviewer was asking me questions, and I was getting entangled. So I told him, let me text you the number of the lawyer, talk to her. She's leading the case. She'll give you the exact numbers of each type of blockade. So we hang up the conversation, and I texted him. And then I remembered that this lawyer that I was talking about, her sister-in-law had been kidnapped from the Nova Festival. And on that day, there were several foreign prime ministers in Israel, and she was doing advocacy for her sister-in-law. So I texted the guy. I said, this is her number. Her sister-in-law has been kidnapped, so she's doing advocacy today. She may not be available right away. Text her, and she'll get back to you. So I send him, and this journalist calls me right back, and he says, really? Her sister-in-law has been kidnapped, and what she's doing today is human rights work for Palestinians? And for us, the answer has always been yes. We need to be holding both troops all the time, because both of them are truth. But it's been a very, very challenging and trying time.
Noa, I thank you so much for all of your insights today.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.